Okay, well, I mean, let's think this through. Reportedly, the Israelis have split Gaza in half. They've pushed deep into the Gaza Strip and they've cut it in half at this point. And they've driven thousands upon thousands of families from northern Gaza into the south. Now, the obvious implication here is that the Israelis are trying to force the expulsion of Gazans into the Sinai. This is what they've always said that they wanted to do. They're trying to force Egypt to facilitate the ethnic cleansing of Gaza by opening up the gates of Rafah and letting the people flee into the Sinai desert. Now, who's that good for? That's not good for Egypt. That's not good for Israel. That's not good for the entire region. Now, Egypt has been crystal clear that they reject this. They've been adamant about that. You know, through the coordinated pressure of the and unity of the Arab world on this issue, they were even able to get the United States to drop the idea, which they had initially supported. So now the official position of Washington is that they do not agree to the expulsion of Palestinians into Sinai. That's the official position of Washington. Jordan has said that any forced expulsion of Palestinians, either from Gaza or from the West Bank, would be regarded by them as a declaration of war, which would obviously end any peace agreements that they have with Israel. Now, a few days back, the head of the CIA met with Abdel Fattah al-Sisi, and he apparently floated the idea of Egyptian soldiers moving into Gaza to take over security control. But Sisi rejected this idea outright, just flat out rejected it, because this looks to me like Washington was trying to come up with some sort of a compromise that Israel might accept that would ultimately make the Gazans Egypt's responsibility. Because they can't control Israel. They can't get them to listen to reason. So they want Egypt to be responsible for the Gazans, either with Gazans being in Sinai or with Egyptians being in Gaza. Now, obviously, like I said, this isn't good for Israel. It's not good for Egypt. It's not good for the region. Obviously, either of these types of scenarios, either Egyptians in Gaza or Gazans in Egypt, would be catastrophic for the region. I mean, imagine, say, 1 million or 1.5 million Gazans forced into the Sinai desert, put into some sort of makeshift refugee camps. These camps would predictably become a breeding ground for militancy, and Hamas would triple in size, quadruple in size. Security in the Sinai has already always been a nightmare for Egypt. That's where the Egyptian version of ISIS was operating, and where the Egyptian version of Al-Qaeda was operating. So any refugee camp in Sinai would inevitably become a huge recruiting and training hub for militants. And they'd have greater freedom to move, to operate. They'd have greater access to equipment, to weapons, to supplies, move around easily, and so on. And of course, they would have every reason to wage an unending campaign of violence against Israel from Sinai, as well as against any Egyptian security forces that ever dared to try to stop them. No, the expulsion of Gazans, the expulsion of Palestinians, would be the most destabilizing, the most destructive thing that could ever possibly happen in that region. And everyone knows it. Egypt knows it, Saudi Arabia knows it, the UAE knows it, Russia and China know it, even Washington knows it at this point. The only one who doesn't seem to know it is Netanyahu, or anyway, he doesn't care. Because Netanyahu is a relic from 20th century Zionism. He's an Ariel Sharon Zionist. And he still thinks that Israel has a future as an instrument of destabilization for the Americans. But I'm telling you, those days are over. Nobody wants that anymore. Not anyone who matters. But the fact is that the U.S. has no control over Netanyahu anymore. He's gone completely rogue. And I think this is driving the Pentagon crazy and the State Department crazy. And because the United States has completely eroded their capacity to exert any sort of diplomatic pressure in the region, on the Arab world, they're having doors slammed in their face everywhere they go. And because the Arab states have built powerful alliances now, not only with each other, but with Russia and with China and the BRICS nations, and it's becoming clear that the Americans are going to get pushed out of the picture. They're becoming less and less relevant in the Middle East. And I don't believe that the owners and controllers of global financialized capital want what Netanyahu wants. I don't think they want to see Egypt and the entire region set on fire. They have plans for the Middle East. As I've talked about before, Mohammed bin Salman and BlackRock have plans for the Middle East, and they have the same plan for the Middle East, and that is for the Middle East to be stable, to be prosperous, to be economically thriving. And crazed, bloodthirsty psychopaths like Netanyahu and the hardline Zionists pose a threat to that project. And the United States is either incapable or unwilling to remove that threat. Therefore, both of these parties, the United States and Netanyahu and the hardline Zionists, have to be removed from the scenario. And I think they will be. And this, in my opinion, is what the OCGFC, the owners and controllers of global financialized capital, this is what they want to see happen. Now, is that what's going to happen? Allahu Alam. The situation is very dire and very urgent, and frankly, it's unpredictable at this point. But, China is soon going to be chairing the United Nations Security Council. And I would expect to see that they will make moves to call for a ceasefire, and they put pressure on the United States to not veto it. Now, if they don't veto it, if the U.S. doesn't veto it, that would obviously be a massive historic shift in U.S. policy towards Israel. But if they do veto it, which is probably what they'll do, then I think that will more or less relegate the United States to irrelevance in the Middle East. And China and BRICS and the Global South will take over the mediation and negotiation process with regards to the Israel-Palestine situation. And China has significant leverage, considerable leverage over Israel at this point. I mean, arguably, they have enough leverage to rival or even surpass the United States. They're Israel's second largest trading partner. They're Israel's largest source of imports. And they have, considerable security, defense, and intelligence cooperation going on. So a Chinese-sponsored mediation backed by the Global South, I think, certainly is in the cards. I think that could definitely happen. And I think that all of the frantic diplomatic activity over the last month has all been moving in this direction. And yes, I think that the Arab states, particularly Saudi Arabia, will have been, over the last month, and even before that, they've been acting as a go-between for the owners and controllers of global financialized capital like BlackRock. They've been acting as a go-between between them and Beijing. Now, the role of the public really matters right now, at this particular moment. Continued protest, continued, expanded, and intensified boycotts matter. Because if the private sector interests of the OCGFC are negatively impacted by the continued savagery of Israel, then this will drive home to them, to the OCGFC, the fact that Zionism, violent Zionist colonialism, is no longer viable in the 21st century. It will further convince them, the owners and controllers of global financialized capital, that these fanatics have to be stopped. Any semblance of any connection to Israel, to Zionism by any company, has to cause a huge walkaway by the market. And like I've said many times, don't just look for companies that overtly support Israel. Look for any company that refuses to support Palestine, that refuses to support a ceasefire, that refuses to oppose the ethnic cleansing in Gaza. As much as possible, I would say Western brands in general should be turned away from. The more this becomes a global movement against Western corporations, the more likely it is that the OCGFC will actively intervene with all the power at their disposal to shut Netanyahu down, because his actions are fueling a worldwide anti-imperialist, anti-Western, anti-corporate power resistance movement. And that's the last thing that any of them want to see happen.